Hello, I'm Jeff Korzenik. I'm the Chief Investment Strategist at Fifth Third Bank, but I'm also an economic researcher and the author of the book Untapped Talent, which makes the business case and shares the best practices of hiring people with criminal records. Let me share some of our work with you. I am very grateful to the board for the opportunity to share my research, and also to Victor Dixon for the very kind introduction he's provided. I'm going to start out by just talking a little bit about why workforce growth is so important and what aspects we have to be paying attention to in order for our country, our economy, and the state of Illinois to thrive. The starting point, of course, is the importance of workforce growth and broad economic growth. This is data from the Congressional Budget Office that shows historic growth rates over periods. And then on the far right-hand side, a projected growth rate through 2028 for GDP growth. And growth comes down to really just two factors. You can slice and dice it different ways, but it boils down to how fast can you grow your workforce and how fast can you grow the productivity of your workforce. In this chart, productivity is shown in blue and workforce growth is shown in green. And you can see that that productivity, the blue, kind of comes and goes. We think we're in a little bit of a cyclical upturn now for the next couple of years, but there's been a clear trend in workforce growth. That's the green line. It's been declining since the 70s. And this has meant that we have seen worse and worse growth rates in the United States. And now we're looking forward at a growth rate through 2028 that is on average going to be below 2%, very paltry growth. We obviously want to find ways to aid this prosperity. And of course, at the company level, this boils down to a labor force shortage. Now, the labor force shortage is often blamed on the pandemic. And there's no doubt the pandemic has worsened the labor shortage and has also pulled some of the things that would have developed over time into a shorter time frame. Right now, one of the problems is what economists call reallocation friction. Consumers in this country change their behavior so abruptly. We work differently, often from home. We shop differently, often from home. We even learn differently, often from home. All of this has caused a dislocation in the kind of jobs that are available and needed versus the people who are job seekers. They may not be in the right geography, have the right skill set. That's going to resolve over time. It'll probably accelerate since unemployment, augmented unemployment benefits have expired. That seems to be prompting people to face up to those very difficult decisions. That'll help near term, but we've also had some permanent losses. Women in particular, millennial women appear to have left the workforce to raise children, particularly true during the period when schools were closed, physically closed, and students had to learn at home. That's obviously a more challenging environment, and many parents thought that needed supervision. Some of those women appear to be coming back, and there were some men who dropped out too, but it's predominantly women statistically. Some appear to be coming back, but I think there are going to be some permanent losses there, as you would expect when people come to the time period of raising families. Older workers have been a strength area for the U.S. economy. We've done a better job of keeping older workers who wanted to stay in place. A lot of them left during the pandemic and appear to have retired for good. So we've done damage, and we've also increased the damage done by social ills that we've seen plaguing the workforce since the 2008-2009 downturn, long-term unemployment. And certainly we have a lot of long-term unemployed who lost their jobs early in the pandemic. They tend to get excluded from consideration for jobs and tend to drop out of the workforce. Obviously, corporate America can do a better job reaching out and making sure they're not excluding people automatically just because of gaps in their employment. But the history of this is that we will lose some workers just because of the length of unemployment. We continue to be plagued by the opioid epidemic. The last 12 months was a tragic record year for overdose deaths in the United States, about 100,000. And of course, from a workforce perspective, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's estimated that 10 million Americans use opioids for non-medicinal purposes. And so that may have them in the workforce, but they probably can't perform to their top capability to contribute to the economy. And they're certainly excluded from places of employment that, for workplace safety, have to offer drug testing. And then criminal justice involvement. And that's going to be the focus of where we see opportunities. But if this weren't bad enough, we have to keep in mind that the backdrop of this is much more important. And even if we were to solve some of the issues that were created during the pandemic, we still have this long-term demographic challenge. And that's the fact that our fertility rates, the number of children that a woman is expected to have over her lifetime, has been declining. And when you go back to that first chart I showed from the CBO, workforce growth is a critical element of economic growth. If you didn't have enough babies 20 and 30 years ago, you're going to have a workforce growth problem today. And that's in many ways where we are today, and it's getting worse. This chart goes back to 1960. Incidentally, those gray vertical areas you see on these charts are periods of recession. You'll see that since the 08-09 recession, our fertility rate has been declining precipitously. And we are well below what's called the replacement rate. How many babies do you need to replace your population? In developed countries, the replacement rate is 2.1 children on average. Mother, father, that's 2, so you need to replace those. And then there's an allowance, that 0.1 is an allowance for infant and early mortality. We're in that 1.6, 1.7 area today. This is such a shortfall that under current policy, immigration can't even make up for this shortage. So no matter what happens as we pass through the pandemic period, no matter how much we recover of the workforce we dropped out because of the pandemic, we still have a labor shortage that will get worse and worse in the decades ahead. At least part of the answer has to lie in making sure that we are reaching into our population and making sure that everyone who wants to work and is able to work is not only able to get a job, but perform to the full extent of their economic potential to contribute. The chart you see before you is the labor force participation rate. This goes back to 1948. This is the percentage of adults, technically civilian, non-institutionalized adults in our population who are in the workforce. That means either actively employed or actively looking for a job. And it was rising in the middle of this chart in the 80s and 90s. That's one of the reasons we were growing at 4% a year on average during those periods. We had a growing workforce because we had more and more people entering the workforce, both the baby boomers coming of age, as well as critically rising levels of female labor force participation. Since 2000, it's been dropping. And then on the far right-hand side here, you'll see the damage done to the pandemic. We have to lift the labor force participation rate. The way to do that is to seek out those who have been marginalized from the labor force. To our thinking, perhaps the very best pool of potential lies with those who've been marginalized, meaning they are either out of the workforce, unable to land a job, or if in a job, don't have the economic mobility to move to other employers and to further their career and become more and more valuable contributors to the economy. Lots of ways of measuring this. I'm going to focus in on the 19 million Americans with a felony conviction, because that's the biggest barrier. There are others as well with very real barriers, people with misdemeanors, people who may have arrests but no convictions, but still have a record because of that. That's where that 70 million number comes up on the right-hand side. But 19 million is a urgent and hard barrier to employment. So why would you want to look to this pool? Well, the starting point for this discussion is this is business, not charity. I'm not proposing businesses do this for charitable reasons or to pursue a social good. They should do it because it gives them the best opportunity to find the best person for every available opening. It broadens out the talent pool. If you're not excluding 19 million Americans, you can consider them. That's obvious. But it also, when done right, is a true pathway to not just any employee. It's certainly not scraping the bottom of the barrel or lowering standards. It's actually, when done right, proven to be a pathway to loyal and engaged employees. That's a recipe for profitability. You find someone who wants to do their job, wants to succeed, and then is loyal and stays in one place. That drives productivity and lowers turnover costs, and that's a recipe for profitability for employers. Employers should consider doing this now before others, before their competitors figure it out. It's worth their figuring it out and also getting to pick kind of the cream of the crop here. Obviously, there's social benefits to it. If everyone does it, we have a more prosperous state and country. We have more prosperous communities. and safer communities, and we have stronger families. But this has to be about the business proposition. What does the business proposition look like? Well, if the end game is following a model that produces highly engaged and loyal employees, how do you get there? Well, it starts with focusing on this huge population as a true talent pool. Don't treat it like an employer of last resort. Treat it as a true talent pool. Find out, how do you create a process for finding who is ready to turn their life around and be a good employee, and making sure they're a good fit for your business. And then at the same time, just as businesses invest all the time in their talent pools, making sure you are equipping people to succeed, which might mean filling gaps that people have in their career history, their knowledge base. And for us, this is really a investment, not a cost. And make no mistake, companies make major investments in talent all the time. Wherever I am in the country, I'd love to use an Illinois example. McDonald's Corporation, moving their headquarters from Oak Brook, Illinois, into the city of Chicago, into the Fulton Market, West Loop neighborhood. They did that explicitly because they were chasing talent, and companies do that all the time. How big an investment was that? Well, for McDonald's, their new headquarters cost them north of $200 million. Companies make these investments all the time. It's just that with this group, you need different kinds of investments, because this group is very often plagued not by a criminal record explicitly, but because they come from backgrounds of deep poverty, multi-generational poverty, a lack of mentorship, and certain specific needs that they need to overcome. How do you do this? How do you find who's ready? How do you fill these gaps? Well, typically, the companies that have thrived in doing this have done through partnerships with nonprofits or with government agencies. They can help identify who's truly ready, and they can also help fill those gaps. And again, the gaps here might be different than employers are used to addressing. It may not be, educating an employee on the latest version of software. It may be making sure they have transportation needs met, housing needs met, clothing. It might mean helping them with a cell phone or basic financial literacy. These are not costs that an employer typically has to bear on their own. It comes about through partnerships with various agencies or workforce boards and the nonprofits that work with them. Simply making sure there's an awareness of how to do it right, and putting the internal resources in place to direct people to these resources. That might mean a well-informed HR professional. It might mean a nonprofit partner. It might mean, as some companies do, having a social worker on staff or a life coach. Resources available to all employees and can benefit the whole workforce, but happen to be critical for the success of these projects. There's all sorts of other models out there, transitional employment, staffing agencies which specialize in this population, work release programs. There's a whole host of ways to do about it. All of them work given the right partnerships and the right partners. They all can deliver on this promise of highly engaged and loyal employees. And even for employers who aren't ready to take that step, I think we still have something to say to them. I wrote in the Chicago Tribune a while back a column about what we've been calling bridging the box. What are intermediate steps? And it starts with recognizing that there are people out there with long ago criminal records who've been gainfully employed that you certainly shouldn't exclude from your hiring practice. They're just another applicant, and yet all too often they are excluded, even though they need no special accommodation. They're just another employee. Use the process of reviewing records, not to exclude people, but to become truly informed on what could get people a felony. It's often not what we think. We've tended to overcharge and overcriminalize in this country, and people age out of crime and grow as people. They simply may clearly show proof that they're not the person they were when they committed the crime. And very often the reality is often those crimes were simply crimes of youth and frankly limited neurological development, as the male brain tends to mature at age 25 to 27 and make bad judgment calls earlier to that. And that's a clear neurological history of a research history on that as well. And as a parent and someone who remembers his youth, I can also attest to that for personal experience. So there's all sorts of things that we can talk to employers about, even if they're not ready to pull the trigger, but can help move them along that path, visiting nonprofits that can be partners with them, visiting companies that are doing it, offering amnesty to employees who may have a criminal record that you don't know about and would be automatically terminated. And then make sure that you're not restricting the companies that you use as vendors from hiring people with criminal records. There's lots of resources out there. The most important, I think, in many ways, is the Getting Talent Back to Work certification for HR professionals. This is offered by SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, largest trade association of HR professionals. 300,000 members across the globe. They get paid from membership and from certification fees. They've waived the certification fees for this requirement, and they've opened it up to non-members. And then some nonprofits that offer playbooks, Dave's Killer Bread Foundation, Checker Foundation, Level Set, a consulting company, has kind of a neat 30-second assessment I'd urge everyone to take on how employment practices may be pushing away people with records, unwittingly excluding that talent pool from success. And then, of course, I hope that my own work, my book, Untapped Talent, which was published by HarperCollins in this spring, will have a positive impact. It profiles many companies that have done this successfully, as well as set some guidelines for how this can work on a company by company basis. With that, I will say thank you for the opportunity to share this work. I'm very grateful to the Innovation Board, and I hope that in the future, should the board decide to go down this path, I can, Fifth Third and I can contribute to the success of any initiative that helps the prosperity of the state of Illinois and our country. Thank you.